Again, good morning. This is Dr. Jeffrey Herbst, President of American Jewish University. In just a moment or two, we'll begin our seminar on anti-Semitism in the age of the virus. Please stay tuned. We're just waiting for the virtual room to fill up. Okay, welcome. My name is Jeffrey Herbst. I am President of American Jewish University. I'd like to welcome you to our ongoing digital programming, B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU. Since the beginning of the crisis, we've tried to present programming that informs, educates, and entertains the community based on Jewish wisdom, but with a view towards today. I'm delighted, therefore, to welcome my guest today, Dr. Stephen Windmueller, who's well known not only in the community but nationwide as an expert in anti-Semitism. Stephen is Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk, Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Service at Hebrew Union College's campus in Los Angeles. He has a long list of publications, speaking engagements, and awards reflecting a lifetime of commitment to understanding Jewish communal life and anti-Semitism, which I'm not going to go through, but I recommend reading as much of his writings as possible. He's in the papers all the time, he's written books, and lots of other things. But it's a pleasure today to welcome you, Stephen. Hope you are well.
Thank you, Dr. Herbst. I'm so pleased to be with you.
Stephen, why don't we get right to it? Maybe you could describe the trends you were seeing in anti-Semitism before late February, early March, when the virus and the economic contraction hit not only the country, but the world.
Yes, I think that the underlying assumptions or position of where we found anti-Semitism was that this would already be a highlight moment in terms of the intensity and increase in harassment, vandalism, and actions taken against the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And we noted that from 2015 moving forward, that there was a clear spike, both here in the United States and elsewhere in the world, of anti-Semitic expression. What I think we have identified is that there are a number of different themes. First, there is the rise of the alt-right, which from the earlier parts of this century have been a core voice in developing and articulating messages directed against the Jewish community. We also note from the left the emergence of a kind of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism posture expressed at times through the BDS movement, but seen in other expressions as well. The importance of understanding these two themes is that it's the first time in American history that we have seen anti-Semitism expressed and experienced from both the right and the left. We also were introduced to the fact that we have been living for some periods of time with the rise of a kind of Islamic anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism, and that is tied in both to the case for and against the state of Israel, but it's also expressed in larger terms against Jews elsewhere in the world. So we see this third category of Islamic response. And the final category, which has two components, is actually anti-Semitism from within parts of the African-American community. The traditional voice of Louis Farrakhan, who has certainly been a presence for some period of time, and the more recent news stories associated with the Black Hebrew Alliance, the Black Hebrew expression, Judaism as a false religion, and that the Black Hebrew Church is the ultimate expression of Jewish thought.
We've had a few more people join us. We now have over 230 participants. Thank you so much for joining this session of B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU. I'm with Dr. Stephen Windmueller. I'll be asking questions of Stephen for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll be delighted to field your questions. Please submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Stephen, you've described already a worrying picture before February and March. What have you seen since the advent of the pandemic?
Well, I think what we have seen is a kind of traditional modality of practice, which we saw in the 14th century with the Black Plague, which we have seen in other conditions associated with anti-Jewish expression. If we move to the first slide, we can begin to weigh in on the particular characteristics of what we are seeing. Leaving aside whether we are able to do that, I would point to the reality that what we are seeing, as the slide points out, is that the traditional items of attack against Jews comes to fore during this kind of pandemic. For example, we are seeing the blood libel model. Jews poisoning the waters is now played out in terms of Jews having created the virus. We see an additional reference to this idea of conspiracy, where Jews are controlling this situation and creating it to create the domination and control within the world. So I think that these are some of the expressions that now relate specifically to how the virus is understood. What we are seeing as well, and this is something happening across the board, is what has been called as Zoom bombing. Efforts on the part of some hate groups to interrupt both Jewish and general meetings with messages of hate and messages of anti-Semitic character. The notions here about conspiracy are specifically tied to understanding the old canard that Jews are particularly powerful. And this power is expressed in terms of how they are able to create, control, and manage the virus in this case, or other situations or circumstances. So this has been a pattern that we have seen every time there is a kind of social disruption. These various kinds of charges and conspiratorial notions. What this has done is to redefine anti-Semitism. It takes it back to its oldest sort of history of practice in the Middle Ages, and reasserts a kind of very primitive a set of ideas about Jews and power and Jews and control. We can go to the next slide. I think that the data continues to remind us of various themes that sort of dominate in this period. Israel is clearly a player in all of this. And certainly we go back to the oldest of the themes in anti-Semitism, the anti-Jewish themes associated both with anti-Semitism in terms of the religious character of its origins. And we see it in terms of creating these negative public images of Jews. So these are two historic models that have certainly been very present during the virus, as the effort to sort of bring these ideas forward is a central theme. As you may know, the ADL has created 11 hate measures. Jews have too much power, Jews are too influential, Jews only care about their own, Jews care more about the state of Israel than their own country. These 11 characteristics are the measures of how and by which the ADL studies and assesses the levels of anti-Semitism. While only about 11 to 14% of Americans fit this category of being called or identified as being anti-Semitic or likely to be anti-Semitic, because they have answered to these 11 questions on 6 or more of them, defining their status, therefore, as more problematic in terms of their attitudes and relationships to Jews. While overall, those numbers are down compared to what we would have seen in the 1940s or 50s, the acts of violence and of attacks on Jews has certainly increased. And in this slide, the 2019 ADL report, which was just released a few weeks ago, points to this sharp increase in these attacks. And I would remind you that over these past several years, as I mentioned, from 2015 moving forward, this has been a pattern of increased numbers of incidents directed against Jews. The most item of real concern, I would suggest to the Jewish community, is that more than half of American Jews today report that they have either experienced, witnessed, or have been made aware of acts of anti-Semitism. And 2/3 of American Jews expressed in various studies have said that they are feeling certainly less safe, less secure in terms of their Jewish identity and living in the United States. And more directly, 1 in 4 are associated with institutions that have actually been either vandalized or have had other incidents directed against them as part of this wave of anti-Semitism. The final characteristic here is that in studies that we have, half of American Jews who have historically felt comfortable wearing symbols that sort of define them religiously or culturally as Jews are doing away with such public displays of those symbols. The next slide, please. I think that what we are particularly concerned about, and this certainly began in Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway, and elsewhere, has been the violence that we have seen in the public square. And there were and have been reports during this period of efforts or attempts to create violent actions or harassment against Jewish institutions and individual Jews, as we know, so that the period or pattern of excessive actions or violence directed against Jews is certainly another factor we are looking at. We are living with 2 other characteristics that we need to pay particular attention to in 2020. In July of this year, the state of Israel is likely to begin or at least take up the conversation on annexation. And that will accelerate the kind of anti-Israel behaviors and actions we have seen up to this point and may certainly increase it. The 2020 elections scheduled for November 3rd are another sort of target point, because the likelihood is that there will be efforts again to use the political scene as a way to express particular passions or positions hostile to Jews and to the Jewish community. We saw that in 2016 in a report issued by the ADL. Around 80 reporters covering the 2016 election. These reporters received via social media a huge amount of personal attacks, harassment, and trolling. So this brings me to really the bottom line of what much of this war is about, especially here in the United States. Are Jews white? And whiteness has now become the measure, in some measure, of how especially the far right and the far left are engaging in their battles with the Jewish community. So how does this manifest itself? We see it in the context of the theory of replacement that the far right has articulated, which is basically, you will not replace us. And that was the message given in Charlottesville. And what that is that there is a growing fear on the part of the right that Jews are pretenders to being white, are trying to replace the white establishment and become the power brokers in this society. And the pushback by the alt-right is to negate the whiteness of American Jews. On the left, the interesting corollary has been that groups on the left have suggested that Jews are no longer minority, that as a minority, we would be petitioners to power. We would be seeking to change the status quo. But we are now seen as powerful. We are too white. So for the left, the story is about the excessiveness of our whiteness. So these are going to be some of the tensions that we will see playing out as we move forward into the fall of 2020. One of the important things that I think we should note is that in the last few weeks, the Senate has passed what already the House had taken up in January, the Never Again Education Act, which is to introduce into public education and American universities Holocaust studies, genocide studies as a required discipline and area of study. Only 12 states in the United States require at this time the study of genocide and more directly the Holocaust. And this initiative, which is funded, will be managed by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and its association to implement across the United States. We will continue to push and encourage the development of coalitions, because this is not only a sort of war against Jews, this is an attack on Asian Americans, on immigrants. We have seen it directed against African Americans at times, and so the need to create the coalitions essential to push back against these expressions of hate. And we will continue to see a huge amount of monitoring, both by the Justice Department, by the Southern Poverty Law Center, certainly by the ADL and the American Jewish Committee, and other groups that will want to monitor the trends that we have seen and are likely to see moving forward.
Stephen, thanks so much for that and for that data. I'd like to drill in on one part of the ADL study that was just released and that you referenced, noting that there were 61 cases of assault against Jews in 2019, half of which took place in New York City. And most of the attacks against the Orthodox population who, as you say, could be publicly observed to be Jewish. There's been a lot of debate and criticism that the mainline or non-Orthodox Jewish population was slow to move to condemn those attacks. What's your view on that?
Well, actually, already in December of this past year, the Jewish community of New York, through the Jewish Federation, its Jewish Community Relations Council, and the National Jewish Agencies, created this very large sort of stand with us moment, drawing very strong numbers of Jews to defend the rights and status of Jews of all different ideological, religious, and cultural persuasions, and to define, in a sense, that an attack on one Jew is an attack on the community. And I think that was the first effort to respond to that. I will point out to you in history, this is a fascinating question. There were times in American history in the early 20th century where Jews were told it is about your behavior. It is about how you conduct yourself. That is a way to diffuse and minimize anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic practice. So this focus on behavior was a very interesting notion. Now, indeed, there have been issues of how various Orthodox groups have convened during the COVID-19 crisis, and that has certainly been a spark to some of the criticism directed against that community. But the point is that it cannot and ought not to be sort of assigned a kind of, because you are Jews and because you behave in this particular way, you are creating this problem. And then the mayor of New York was in fact called out on that, and that is an important point to deal with some of the social religious realities of a particular community and helping them to, in a sense, retool how they operate and manage during a crisis like this. So this has been an interesting moment to sort of measure the behaviors we see of folks who are critical of Jews, and also the response of public officials in managing these types of issues.
This is Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University, as part of our online programming series, B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU. I'm talking with Dr. Stephen Windmueller about anti-Semitism in the age of the virus. I'll ask a few more questions and we'd be delighted to take your questions. Please submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Stephen, as I understand the data that you suggested, two factors going on at once. One, the measures of traditional anti-Semitism across the population going down. There are fewer people who are meet the definition, ADL's definition, at least, of anti-Semitism. Number of anti-Semitic acts and incidents going up, which suggests that there's a small and perhaps shrinking core, albeit of ever more virulent anti-Semites, that this is not a question of a popular set of opinions. Anti-Semitism is in fact deeply unpopular, but there are pockets, as you say, on the left, on the right, in the Islamic community, in the African American community, which are becoming more active. So how does traditional measures like increased education, public campaigns work when it's not a problem of the general public, but a problem of very small numbers, albeit of very small numbers who are conducting worrisome actions?
Yes, I mean, I think both the ADL and the federal government have pointed to the notion of the Lone Ranger, the act taken by an individual who online reads and has access to the protocols and declarations of either the far right, the left, or any of these other voices, and identifies with those messages. And then he or she may act on those. And that has become sort of the new profile of the kind of anti-Semitic behavior we are seeing. So that the individuals who acted in Poway and in Pittsburgh and elsewhere are expressions of this kind of social media phenomenon. So as part of their efforts, the Anti-Defamation League has been particularly focused on working with the high-tech industry and the platform communities, those who are launching these various sites and media options, as a way to figure out how do you, on the one hand, permit freedom of speech, but on the other, account for hate messaging that can and does energize and embrace certain voices who will act on those particular messages. So it's a much more complex, it's a civil liberties issue, it's a kind of model that we have not had to anticipate or manage in the past. And that is distinctively what we have seen also against African Americans. We've seen actions against even Muslims in the world, again, constructed by these kinds of individuals acting on the messaging that they are receiving.
Stephen, we focus mainly on the United States so far, but too difficult to take account of all global trends. But to what extent is what we're seeing in the United States now mirrored in other countries with significant Jewish populations? And to what extent is this a unique American phenomenon?
Well, I think that much of what we are seeing in Europe in particular is really directed from two sources. The anti-Israel sentiments, some of which are driven by longstanding opposition to certain Israeli policies, and more directly, the presence in Europe of a significant body of Muslims, some of whom have become radicalized and some of whom are acting on their radicalism in ways that have been directed, as we know, in France and elsewhere in Europe against Jewish communities and Jewish institutions. So that has been particularly challenging. The Europeans have a deep and long history embedded in both the religious themes of Christianity and of the rise of the church in its European origins, so that what we are dealing with in part has long-standing roots to a kind of anti-Judaism that was messaged and articulated through the centuries. And as David Nurnberg of the University of Chicago Divinity School has suggested in his writings, these values or these ideas are constructed in such a way as to constantly place Judaism in competition with or in conflict with other ideas and norms, whether it's Christianity versus Judaism and supersessionism, whether it's seen in the context of modernity and how Jews respond to modernity. And his argument has been that you cannot sort of eradicate and alleviate the seeds of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism from a culture of European societies where it's deeply embedded, and there are sort of these perspectives about who Jews are and what Judaism represents. So it's a collective of both the contemporary political scene, the Arab-Israel agenda, as well as these deeply rooted historic notions of religious wars.
I'm with Dr. Stephen Windmueller talking about anti-Semitism in the age of the virus. I'm Jeff Herbst, president of American Jewish University. Let's now go to your questions, and we're beginning to get quite a lot of questions in the Q&A chat in the Q&A room. Please don't hesitate to submit your questions. I've already got more than I could possibly ask Stephen in the minutes we have left, but why don't I make a start? Stephen, one question actually several different people ask, could you go a little deeper in terms of who's making the tie today between Jewish community and the advent of the virus? As you say, that has deep historical antecedents, but can you say a little bit more about exactly who's pushing that at the moment?
Well, we certainly see coming out of Iran very specific linkages by the Iranian authorities and the effort there to use their existing conflict with Israel as a sort of staging ground for additional attacks, citing the virus as sort of a case in point. So that's certainly one source. We're seeing as well groups on the far right that have taken advantage of this opportunity, in a sense, to play to the economic dysfunctionality or challenges that are facing American society now, and to sort of pin the mantle or the definition of who's at fault here and who's creating these kinds of dislocations of our economy. And so using, again, the notions of Jews as powerful, influential, and controlling. So I think we see some of that as some of the source points for this. What I worry about is that as this economy moves forward and we see more dislocation in it, that we may see more public disturbances similar to what we have seen in Michigan and elsewhere in the upper Midwest, where we have seen expressions of attacks on these governors and on state legislatures of open up the economy, yet using symbols of Nazi-like and anti-Semitic-like thematics that are applied or are connected to all of these demonstrations. So I think there is some concern that this notion of copycatting, which is a very common idea in the anti-Semitic agenda, which is if someone else has tried it and it seems to have a kind of play, that others will play to that as well.
Stephen, thank you. Lots of questions. Please keep them coming through the Q&A function. Stephen, several different people in our audience have asked how much of the anti-Semitism that you've talked about, the upsurge in bigotry, can be attributed to President Trump?
That, of course, has been a common conversation point, and there are some writers who have certainly pinned to the president a good deal of this sort of anti-social, anti-Semitic behavior. My sense is that some of the realities we're seeing on the ground are simply taking cues from some of the messaging that we have seen from this administration and have created for themselves the articulation of using the attacks against Jews as the way to best express their frustration, as well as what they perceive to be the president's message of make America great again, of American nationalism, and of an America that is seemingly white and is engaged in the protection of its citizens.
Steve, we had an interesting question about intermarriage, which I'll interpret this way. Inside the Jewish community, there's been a discussion now for decades about the existential threat of the Jewish community becoming smaller through intermarriage, less affiliation with synagogues, and the like. At the same time, perhaps paradoxically, you say that a good part of the upsurge in anti-Semitic attacks is because people fear the Jews are becoming too powerful or are too powerful. So you must have thought about the paradox of the Jews worried about their diminishing and becoming smaller, and other groups, small but virulent, saying they're too powerful. Is there something to be explored in that paradox?
Now, the interesting thing is the extraordinary role that American Jews, despite their small numbers, are playing in this society. And this is actually the trigger point for much of the frustration and anger on the political right, on the alt-right, and to probably a somewhat lesser degree on the left, but it's certainly present, which is Jews are seen as economically powerful. And they would cite to you the examples that Jews are, the top 5 donors to Hillary Clinton's campaign were American Jews. 7 of Donald Trump's top 17 were Jewish. So they equate this sort of economic power as more definitive of Jewish influence than the numbers per se, and would argue that the case against the Jews is that they are exceeding their weight. They are sort of exercising this sort of role of being politically active well beyond their voting numbers and well beyond their population statistics.
Stephen, you've cited the important work that's being done by the ADL, other groups, measures in Congress that have been passed, increased education efforts, increased monitoring sensitivity, and I think we both agree that these are well-intentioned efforts by very smart people. Yet we seem to be losing the battle against anti-Semitism. So are we doing something wrong, or is there another avenue or an additional avenue to be pursued?
Well, we had constructed the battle against anti-Semitism from the 20th century. In other words, we're applying some of the same tactics and strategies and actions that we had undertaken in the 1930s through the 1940s. In reality, the United States has changed radically and rapidly. And what we are now needing to do is to shift some of these strategies and actions. For example, we always believed that the best way to oppose and fight anti-Semitism was to use key elites in the society, whether that represented the presidents of universities, of business corporations, of civic organizations, American politicians, to speak out against racism, anti-Semitism, and hate as non-American. That doesn't work in the 21st century in a kind of social media culture. So that is principle one. The second is that some of the measures that were introduced about how you measure anti-Semitism worked because you could judge and monitor hate organizations, the neo-Nazi parties, the patriot and militia groups. Well, what has happened is that the shift has gone basically underground, so that the techniques associated with monitoring structures and institutions and membership groups is not a viable and satisfactory outcome at this point. And that is precisely why I think there is this shift to understanding what social media is creating and how we isolate and marginalize those lone rangers, which is the essential piece. I mean, our sense is that it is not that Americans are becoming more anti-Semitic. It is that those who are anti-Semites and are acting on it are becoming more violent and overt and aggressive in some of their practices and responses.
Stephen, that's a very interesting observation that those fighting anti-Semitism are, to some extent, fighting the last war, as you say, 20th century prejudice. Do you think we need new institutions or organizations to fight the anti-Semitism that you've described in the 21st century?
I have to applaud the ADL in that it has actually sort of reinvented itself and is in the process of continuing to sort of grow and redefine its mission in terms of its work. And I think we will see other organizations also that exist shift some of the focal points of how to respond and deal with these new forms and outcomes of hate. So I'm not arguing here for new institutions, rather that we empower those that have historically played these important roles for our community and give them the tools and the incentives to actually achieve the battleground, the new battleground that they will be undertaking.
I'm with Dr. Stephen Windmueller. We're discussing anti-Semitism in the age of the virus. This is Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University, as part of our series B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU. We have just a few more minutes, Stephen, and you've been very generous with your time and observations. And we have a whole lot more questions to answer. But the thrust of several questions from the audience is, given the multi-pronged sources of anti-Semitism you described, the ability of them to manipulate social media, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Well, I think we are in a battle, and it is a battle of people's minds, their ideas, and their knowledge. And we will be seeing much more of this sort of educational initiative being waged in the social media and in terms of other platforms that will be speaking to new audiences. My concern is those 18 to 35 whose life history does not include, obviously, any sort of connection or ties to genocide and the Holocaust, to the birth and founding of the State of Israel, and to other issues, including the civil rights movement. And when I look at the data, for example, the generations that I just cited, Gen Z and millennials, only 1/4 of millennials and Gen Z folks have any knowledge or can identify the Holocaust in any coherent and factual way. 1/4. So it suggests to me that we have an educational piece here that requires a kind of different modality of delivery. And that will be why I'm putting a good deal of emphasis on the social media framework and on alternative ways by which education is provided. We would remind ourselves that many of us daily read a newspaper or watch television news or enter into a variety of venues to take the ideas of what is happening in our culture and society on a regular basis. Younger Americans secure their news from their Facebook, social media pages, and the online resources. And we have to, in a sense, be in that marketplace if we are going to, in a sense, compete with the ideas and the setting of the historic as well as contemporary record of who we are, what our sort of agendas or interests or contributions to civilization have been and will be, as a very different way to deliver messages as we move forward.
Stephen, last issue let's discuss, go back to what you talked about Israel, of course, anti-Israel sentiments in the Middle East and elsewhere fueling anti-Semitism, and your observation that debate around annexation or extending sovereignty might cause an uptick. Should the Israelis be sensitive to that? And how do they respond when you bring this up?
Well, I think they and the whole sort of pro-Israel communities in Europe, the United States, and certainly the government of Israel itself will need to lay out the case for why annexation or why the change in the status, the legal status quo, and put in context the story. And that hopefully will be the ways by which the conversation will move forward. If actions are taken without placing this in a historic frame and giving meaning to it for audiences that did not live through the 1967 Six-Day War, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, or understand the Peace for Galilee campaign, or any of the other historic moments of the Israel sort of storyline, then it is difficult and clearly less understandable for them as to what this may mean to the Jewish people, what it means to the state of Israel, and what the impact is for Palestinians. I think that these conversations should begin now and need to be placed in a context that allow for both Jewish audiences, because I would argue that many Jews also are going to be very troubled and disturbed by what they may see in terms of a pushback and anger on the part of some within the Arab world and within the Palestinian community, as well as what they will see from the Europeans, who have already announced efforts to contain or try to push back against Israeli annexation. So this is a strategy that needs really a beginning, middle, and end. And my argument and case with the Israelis has been, you need to build this step by step as a way to help your audiences best understand the reality of why this is happening and what it may mean and what are the prospects for a longer term peaceful Middle East.
Stephen, those are great points. Able to squeeze in one more question from the audience. Several people have asked, well, what can they do? There's obviously organizations, there are leaders in the Jewish community who are fighting these fights every day. For the ordinary person, as it were, are there suggestions you have to fight anti-Semitism?
Well, I think the first issue is that we are a very divided Jewish community. And we need to understand that the anti-Semite does not take note that we are Democrats or Republicans, that we are pro-Israel or have questions about Israel, that we have particular views according to different Jewish halachic and ideological positions. So, I think, Jeff, the very first agenda here is that the Jewish community needs to realize that this moment in time requires fewer sort of contentious moments or elements between us, amongst us, and requires a kind of coherent messaging of the Jewish community about what are really our shared values, what our contributions have been and will be. I think that's principle one. The second thing is that individuals have to press their Jewish affiliated organizations, their congregations, their sisterhoods and membership groups in speaking out and reaching out to other organizations and community groups. This is not a fight that is singularly the Jewish battle. This is a shared opportunity to embrace other folks who are troubled by what is happening in the United States for various reasons. The economic issues, the class and race tensions, the issues associated with homeless and poverty, and finding common ground with other communities has been historically a strategy that the Jewish community has embraced, and that is needed now, and individual Jews can help encourage and promote such initiatives. And finally, to be well-read, to understand the characteristics of what is happening in America and in the world, to understand the history of anti-Semitism, and to understand the various strategies for competing and pushing back against it, challenging it in all of its various forms. And to be willing, finally, to articulate a case that the American story is different. As Barry Weiss in her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism suggests, this is a country which has no history of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. It is the only society in the Western world that Jews have lived through and with that can make that declaration. Our Constitution says there will be no religious tests. Our presidents continuously have supported and nurtured the idea of individual liberty, freedom of religious expression, and so forth. I think we need to remind ourselves and our neighbors that this is a unique moment, and this is a society that has actually historically pushed back against hate.
Wise words, Stephen. Thank you so very much. This has been Dr. Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University, talking with Dr. Stephen Windmueller on anti-Semitism in the age of the virus. This is part of our ongoing series, B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU, where we seek to inform, educate, and entertain the community based on age-old Jewish wisdom, but with an eye on today and tomorrow. Please visit our website, aju.edu. We have a lot more programming coming up. We're on 5, 6 days a week sometimes, and I think you'll see that what has yet to come will be fascinating and interesting. So we encourage you to join us. Stephen, thanks again so much for today. Your words are always wise and informative. We look forward to further discussions in the future. To all who have joined us, thank you so very much.